This is a brief tutorial on retrievals of temperature and moisture profiles. I'm Scott Lindstrom from SIMS. Retrievals typically use data from sounders. Sounding instruments look through the atmosphere, and their measurements are used to infer the structure and composition of the atmosphere. The information that the satellite senses comes from the top of the atmosphere, sometimes referred to as TOA. Sounder instruments typically have more channels than imagers, so they're sampling a broader spectrum of the atmosphere. The goal of a retrieval is to take the sounding measurements and invert them to create the atmosphere that is consistent with the observations that are sensed. This is complex because different gases have different absorbing qualities at different wavelengths, and many gases have variable concentrations in the atmosphere. Most retrievals try to simulate what is happening with a radiative transfer model, or RTM. You use successive outputs from the RTM to estimate the distribution of temperature, moisture, and the trace gases. The physics and dynamics of what's going on in the atmosphere, that is the wind, doesn't need to be known for a retrieval. That's different from data assimilation. The biggest difficulty with retrievals is that the solution is ill-posed. There's more than one combination of temperature and moisture profiles that could yield the observations that you have. The radiances are coming from deep and overlapping layers. There are a couple of ways around this. You can increase the number of spectral bands, or you can start with an initial guess profile and modify that. This second one is the easier solution. Retrievals typically mean you are minimizing a so-called cost function between the observations and the simulation. There are some difficulties. If you assign too much weight to the observations, then the fitted profile is going to be influenced by any noise that might be in the observations, and too much of that noise will show up in the final profile. If you assign too little weight to the observations, then the fitted profile might not change relative to the background. So there's a balance you have to achieve. You are iterating to a solution. You start with a profile that matches the observations closely. Then you see if the simulation is accurate, and if it's not, you adjust the profile, and you continue that until you have a good enough solution. But you need a tool to do this. Many retrievals use a radiative transfer model as that tool. You use that model to determine whether the solution that you have gives simulated observations that match the actual observations. If it doesn't match, you compute the difference between the two, and you modify the solution and you try again. And you do that until you come to a solution that's close enough for you. This flowchart kind of shows you graphically what's going on. You start with your first guess. If there's any bias in there, you account for that. Then you calculate your transmittance. You use a model to compute the radiances, and then you compare what has been computed by the model to what you have observed. You compute the residuals. The residual is the difference between those two. If the residuals are small enough, you've succeeded, but if they're not, you modify the profiles, you modify the skin temperatures, you use, again, the radiative transfer model to compute the transmittance, and then you compare it again to the observations. So you're in this cycling part here for some number of cycles that are predetermined, or until you get success. I hope this short training has given you a better understanding of how retrievals occur. Thanks for listening.